We just lost. No, we lost someone. It was 33, and then now there's 32.
Okay, why don't we get started?
How did we lose a person already?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Science Friday, which is organized by Journal Club. Journal Club is an organization led by a team of students and faculty members who train new people to present their scientific journals and, most importantly, provide a forum for database discussion. We take on almost any issue that you are passionate about. If you would like to be trained as a presenter or are a veteran presenter looking for a venue, please email Anya and we will work with you to make that happen. I want to take a moment to acknowledge a person on the Journal Club exec team. Please give it up for Anya for her amazing leadership and teamwork in Journal Club. Woo-hoo! The team is mentored by Dr. Paul Hauser and Luke Dave. There are 3 leaders. Akshay handles the training of people on our team, Anya handles the training of presenters, and I curate our talks and organize Science Friday itself. This is how our meeting today is going to run. Today, Wes is going to present for about 20 minutes. There will be time for questions mid-presentation. Please type your questions into the chat as you have them. The simpler, the better. We will organize them, either call on you or ask the questions for you prefer. We are recording this presentation for YouTube, and if you would not like your comments to show up in the YouTube video, please private message your questions to Akshay. During the presentation, we ask that you keep your cameras on and stay muted unless you're asked to clarify a question. Next week's presenter is JC member Caroline Phipps. We hope to see you there. But now please give it up for Wes.
Thank you, Willow. I'm going to share my screen. Get started here. Folks can see my screen okay? All right, so my talk today is called So You Want to Get a STEM Degree? But before I jump into it, we'd love to know a little bit about my audience. So if you are a senior, can you give me a party reaction? Or if you feel so inclined, can you unmute yourself and make some noise? If you're a senior, let me know.
Emotionally a senior, or?
All right, so a handful of folks. Okay, regardless of whether you are a senior or not, if you are interested in getting a STEM degree, so a science, technology, engineering, or math degree, can you give me an appropriate reaction of your choice? Or even if you're not interested in getting a STEM degree, but you think you might have a friend, family member, or someone you care about who might be interested in going to college and getting a STEM degree, can you give me a reaction? Okay, delightful. Okay, so just about everyone, which is more or less what I've expected. You've come to the right place, because today we are going to talk about factors that influence whether people who want to get STEM degrees actually successfully get those STEM degrees. So our motivation starts with David and Goliath, not the biblical story, but the 2012 book by Malcom Gladwell, and a 2013 talk that Gladwell gave in which he cited this fairly remarkable claim from the book. He says, your odds of successfully getting a science or math degree falls by 2 percentage points for every 10-point increase in the average SAT score of your peers. Okay, so what he's saying is that as the average SAT score of your peers goes up, no matter who you are, right, your chances of getting a STEM degree go down. To put that in perspective, I went to a random college ranking site and pulled out the very first school that at the top of the list, and that was the University of Central Florida. It has an average SAT score of 1250. Then I went and looked up a small vocational school in Boston, one that my wife affectionately refers to as the Monkey Institute of Trucking, and it has an average SAT score of 1535. So if Malcom Gladwell is right, you are almost 60% more likely, again, same student, 60% more likely to graduate with a STEM degree from UCF than you are from MIT. And you get to go to school in a place that looks like this, as opposed to a place that looks like this. That's an actual MIT building, by the way, #NoFilter. All right, here's the thing. Malcom Gladwell is not an academic. Malcom Gladwell is a storyteller, and sometimes storytellers take a few liberties. So the actual quote from his talk involves, he quotes Mitchell Chang from UCLA, who is an academic. And thanks to what we've learned here at Nueva, in ISOS, and right here in Journal Club, we know that we don't actually have to take Gladwell's word for it. We can actually go read the paper and see what it says. So that's what I did. And what does the paper actually say? Well, let's start with the methodology. They took survey data from 30,000 students, and they winnowed that down to about 3,000 students in 159 institutions who said that they were going to major in biology, chemistry, health science, or psychology. Then they looked and they said, how many of those students were still in those majors at the end of their freshman year? Now, they looked at a bunch of different variables, including the one that we're interested in, which they called institutional selectivity. So how selective was this school? And their proxy for that was the average SAT score. They looked at a bunch of different variables that I'll talk about in just a second. But another one that was really interesting is they also asked the student, was this school your first choice? Okay. And there are plenty of others, as we'll see in this table. This is a table from the paper. Now, this is quite dense, but what we'll look at here is I've highlighted two of the lines, and I'll explain what we're looking at here. So on the left is a list of all the variables they've looked at. This first column here is just R. That's just simple correlation. So positive numbers indicate positive effect, negative numbers indicate negative effect. The following 5 columns, what they did was they constructed a logistic regression model, and they tried to predict whether a given student with a given set of characteristics would persist in getting a STEM degree or not. And the numbers here are log odds ratio. So the number 1 means the baseline percentage was multiplied by 1. So numbers above 1 indicate positive effect, numbers below 1 indicate negative effect. And if we look at these two columns, these two rows that I've highlighted, here's selectivity index at 0.98. So the paper does indeed find that for every 10 points of SAT score, there was a negative 2% effect, right? So Gladwell's claim is in fact backed up by the paper. Here's the other one that I thought was really interesting. If this school was your first choice, that is a negative 20% effect on your chances of getting a STEM degree. Okay. So the paper says that it's probably true. And then it looks at why is this true? So there are 2 reasons that I want to talk about today. The first one is called weeding out. So weeding out is this practice where first-year intro courses in a given major are intentionally more difficult, and they have less support in an effort to discourage students who might be less persistent. Now, you might ask, well, why would weeding out be more prevalent at more selective schools? And the answer to that probably is because more selective schools generally have a status or reputation to protect, right? So this notion that if you get a degree from, say, MIT, they want that degree to mean something. They want that degree to mean that you've met some certain bar, right? And the easiest way to make sure that their graduates meet that bar is if they get the students who they don't think are going to meet that bar to quit early. The second one is from a theory from psychology called relative deprivation theory. It's this idea that humans aren't terribly good at measuring ability on an absolute scale, and so instead we tend to compare to others. In this picture, I'm going to highlight this last athlete in the back here who maybe thinks of herself as like not so fast compared because if you look at this race, right, she comes in last place in this race and she loses to the first place person by about 10 yards, okay? But this picture is actually the 2012 Olympic final of the 200 meters. So this person is only quote unquote not that fast when compared to like the 5 fastest humans on the planet. Another example of relative deprivation theories that's a little bit more related to STEM degrees is a little anecdote about 6 friends. Not these 6 friends. These 6 friends were all college freshmen, and they wanted to major in computer science. This first friend we'll call super genius friend. Super genius friend, like his name implies, was a super genius, the kind of person that you could take an arbitrarily complex thing, explain it to him once, he would understand it right away, he would be able to answer all the questions you had about it and probably synthesize the next few concepts that it implied, right? The other 5 friends who were quite smart in their own right were not super geniuses. And so we will just call them not super genius, not super genius, not super genius, not super genius, and definitely not a super genius, if you know what I'm saying. Now, These 6 friends all took the first class in the computer science program together. And it was really hard. Now, the 5 non-super genius friends thought, wait a minute, we have this huge advantage. We have a super genius friend who knows everything, so we can just go ask him for help. But it turned out that was the exact wrong thing to do because he couldn't help them. He didn't know how to help them. He was so smart that he couldn't understand why they didn't understand things. And in fact, the most common phrase he would use when they asked him for help, asked earnestly, not to be mean, was, what, you don't see that? Right? Now, at the end of the semester, all 6 friends, super geniuses and non-super geniuses, all passed the class. But 2 of the friends decided they just weren't smart enough. They looked at super genius friend and they said, look, that's what a computer science major looks like. That's what it takes to get a computer science degree. I'm never going to be that smart. Super genius friend, by the way, had been programming for several years before college and none of the other friends had. Right? So 2 of these friends decided they're just not smart enough. They should just quit now. And so they changed majors. Right? That's relative deprivation theory. All 6 friends passed the class. They were all smart, but 2 of them compared themselves to super genius friend and decided they weren't smart enough. Okay, so the paper says it's probably true. We have some reasons why. What should we do about it? Malcom Gladwell has a very helpful suggestion. Malcom Gladwell says, don't go to your first choice school. Go to your third choice school instead, right? Go be a big fish in a small pond. You should go be the super genius in your group of 6 friends, right? That's going to make it much more likely for you to get a STEM degree. So, question for my seniors. How many of you are convinced? How many of you are like, oh man, like Les, I really wish you had told me this like a month ago or like back in December or whenever I chose like what school I'm going to so I could choose not to go to my first choice school and go to my third choice school instead. Anyone convinced by this? No? Good. All right. Because it turns out when we go back and look at the paper, there's a bunch of other variables that affect whether you successfully get a STEM degree or not. And so what I did was I went to that table and I pulled out all the variables that have statistical significance. And then I color coded them green for positive and red for negative. We'll go through what they are now. This first one here is entering degree aspiration. So if you came into college thinking that you might want to get a master's or a PhD or go on to get an MD, you were way more likely to make it to the end of your freshman year, 35 to 40% more likely. If you came into college saying that you had a goal, which was to work to find a cure for a specific health problem, you were also more likely to persist, 8 to 14%, depending on the model. These next 2, fairly straightforward, self-explanatory. The higher your high school GPA and the more years of high school math that you took, the more likely you were to persist in a STEM major. These next 2 we talked about already. I'm going to skip over this third one for a second and we'll come back to it. Look at these last 2. Freshmen who participated in research were 64% more likely to persist in their majors at the end of the year. If, as a freshman, they joined a club related to their major, what they call a pre-professional or department club, they were even more like more than 2 times more likely, almost 130% more likely to persist in STEM if they joined that club. Okay, so these effects totally swamp the effect of selectivity. Now, I'll note, of course, that these are not necessarily, these don't necessarily indicate correlation, don't necessarily indicate causation, right? They're just correlation. It could be that the students who were most interested in STEM and most interested to persist were also the ones who are most likely to join a club, right? But we'll get back to that in just a second. But some summaries, some ideas from this paper, some things we can do to combat this effect and to make ourselves more likely to get STEM degrees. Before college, aim high, right? Think about like a goal or an aspiration or an advanced degree that you might like to get. Taking more math classes, that helps. And also getting better grades. And I put a little silly emoji next to this because obviously, all things being equal, we'd all want to get better grades, but really getting better grades is just a proxy for having better study habits. Things that we can do during college, as suggested by the paper, included do research and joining a club related to your field. Now, I want to come back to this. I want to say a few words about this item that I've highlighted in red here, which is got advice from a professor. So some of you might be thinking, hang on a second, my advisor is always telling me that I should go talk to my teachers and that they're really nice and that I should build a relationship with them. But this seems to indicate the opposite, that if I do, then I'm much less likely to get a STEM degree. So what I'll point out here is that there's some selection bias going on, right? Like the students who were most likely to seek advice from a professor were probably the ones who weren't doing that well, right? However, something to keep in mind, if you were at Jenna Lang's presentation last month about the belief in innate ability versus and how that correlates to whether students successfully got degrees, we also know that there might be some bias and or stereotype threat here. So if a student who's struggling goes to a professor and the professor decides this person doesn't look like a STEM major, right? They might be more likely to counsel that person not to persist. All right, we'll come back to this toward the end of this talk. So the observant among you might have noticed that the book, David and Goliath, was published in 2012. So you might be asking, wait a minute, when was the study actually published? And the answer is that this study was published in 2008. Now, 2008 was kind of a long time ago, right? In 2008, Facebook was a literal paper book full of faces. And we all thought that George W. Bush was the worst president in American history. So a few things have changed since then. And the question is, have these results held up since 2008? And the answer is not really, right? We know that science is not linear. It's not like you do a study and then just like things are set in stone forever. People come and try to reproduce your results. And in 2009, Kevin Egan tried to reproduce these results, and he found the opposite. He found that the more selective your school is, the more likely you are to get a STEM degree. Chang comes back in 2010 collaborating with Egan, and he reproduces those results. There have been a ton of studies since then on this subject, and those studies have generally been mixed. So some of them find positive correlation, so more selective schools, more likely to get STEM degrees. Some of them find negative correlations. Some of them find no correlation at all, right? So what we can say here is that school selectivity is not proven to be correlated with retention. If you were one of those seniors who got into your first choice school and have decided to go to first choice school, you're okay. Also, congratulations. Now, if selectivity is not proven to be correlated with retention, does that just invalidate all the paper's findings? Like, geez, Grandpa, what did you read me this thing for? If you don't get that reference, by the way, you have not seen the greatest movie of all time, and you should. And the answer to that question is no. Studies since, and there have been quite a lot of them, agree that the strategies for improving retention that are cited in the paper, along with others, are effective, right? So one of the ones that I want to focus on, I'll talk about all of them in just a second, but one of the ones I want to focus on is, remember we said that joining a club makes you more likely to persist in STEM. And more generally, the research finds that if a student joined a peer group with similar academic or career interests, that they were much more likely to persist in STEM degrees. And that brings us back to the 6 friends, because the 3 not super genius friends did exactly that when they were in college. They decided, hey, we don't have to work with super genius friend who makes us feel like we're not smart enough to be in this major. We can work with each other. We all have similar abilities. We all have similar interests. We all want to get computer science degrees. This, by the way, is one of the reasons that here at Nueva, we put so much emphasis on collaboration within our STEM classes, because it's such an important skill. So what happened to the 3 not super genius friends? Well, one of them is the VP of engineering at GitLab. One of them is the VP of engineering at a little bank called Capital One. And one of them, as you may have guessed by now, teaches computer science at this amazing high school with incredible students. The point is, these 3 not super genius friends, all of whom at some point thought that they might not be smart enough to get a computer science degree. Between them, they earned 6 computer science degrees and spent over 60 years as successful professional software engineers. So, some takeaways from the literature review of how to persist in STEM. First one is preparation. So as we mentioned earlier, now is the time to build good study skills and strong time management skills. When you have support and the ability to fail, now is the time to do that before you get to college. Also, taking more math and science classes, AKA college counseling knows what they're talking about. If they tell you to take 2 science classes, you should take 2 science classes. Second one, stereotype threat. We talked about this earlier. Studies consistently show that historically Black colleges and universities have higher STEM retention rates. Also, schools with diverse faculty have higher STEM retention rates. What does that mean? We can generally conclude that if you go to a school and there are role models that look like you, you're more likely to persist in STEM. Institutional programs. So we've talked about research opportunities, especially research opportunities for freshmen, but other things that have proven to have positive effect from an institutional context include retention programs and official faculty mentorship programs. So as you're, these might be some things that you want to ask about when you're thinking about where you want to go to school. Remember that reading out is a thing. So if your first year is hard, remember, it's that way on purpose. It's hard for everybody, and they're trying to get you to quit. If you make it past your first year, it's going to get easier. Couple more. One is know your why. Know why you want to get a STEM degree. And when things get hard, you can fall back on that motivation, right? This is actually good advice for persisting, not just in STEM degrees, but just about anything. If something gets hard, fall back on thinking about why you were there in the first place. I'll note here that making a lot of money is a bad why. Not because that's not a good goal in and of itself, but specifically for STEM degrees, it turns out there's a lot of majors that potentially you can make a lot of money in, which, by the way, is why students who leave STEM majors, the number one major that they transfer into is business or finance. Last one here is finding people and opportunities to validate and support you. So this could include faculty, this could include mentors, this could include clubs, peers, or just your friends, which is why at the very beginning of this talk, I asked if anyone might have a friend, even if you're not interested in getting a STEM degree, if you might have a friend who's interested in getting a STEM degree, because it turns out you might have a chance to help them persist in getting that degree with your validation and support. Last thing I want to note here is that it turns out this isn't just a STEM problem. A recent study found that between STEM, humanities, business, education, and health sciences, STEM actually had the highest freshman retention rate of all 5. So really, this isn't a talk about how to get a STEM degree, it's a talk about how to persist in getting any degree. So that's it. That's my whole talk. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. No, just kidding. You don't have to do that. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.
All right. I see some questions in the chat. Miles had a clarification question about the study, if you like to.
Hey, Akshar, I just wanted to cut in with a real quick question. Wes, that was freaking awesome storytelling. That was my question.
Thanks for the question, D. Miles, do you want to? I can ask it for him.
Yeah, I can ask it. So
Okay.
my question was basically like, does degree retention mean that they continued in the degree they started with or continued in any STEM degree? Like if I was a CS major and it was too hard, so I switched to bio, would that count as retention or not?
Right, good question. So in the initial paper, the only thing they looked for was whether they stayed in one of those 4 majors. So if you started as a psychology major and you switched into health sciences, that counted as retaining. But if you started as a psychology major and switched into computer science, that did not count.
Got it.
Yeah, and I'm getting a few questions from people about where the super genius is now.
So super genius, I thought people might ask that. I didn't put it on the slide. So super genius friend is now a yoga teacher. No, just kidding. A super genius friend is also a software engineer, but he actually, I like to say that because he actually did take some time off and was a yoga teacher for a couple of years.
of this cool story.
Wes, I know there's not a lot going on in the chat, but there's a ton of conversation going on back here. This is just really thought provoking. Thanks for answering the question about the super genius. We had that one as well.
Yeah, Jack.
I'm curious if does retention mean that they fully completed the degree they set out to complete, or was it like they earned a STEM degree somehow eventually?
Yeah, good question. So one of the limitations, and so actually Chang talks about this himself in his 2010 paper. One of the limitations of the original paper is that they only looked at retention after freshman year, right? So it might be the case that someone had a winding path where they said like, oh, I want to be a bio major. And then at the end of the freshman year, they're like, no, I want to be like a finance major. And then after their sophomore year, they're like, nope, just kidding. I'm going back to bio, right? So this paper would have counted them as not retained because at the end of their freshman year, they had chosen a different major. But if they came back to it later, then they might have still gotten a STEM degree later.
Yeah,
I have
Jack.
an actual question. Wes, how did you approach when you thought about doing this talk? How did you approach this? You started with the anecdote from essentially Malcolm Gladwell.
I essentially started. So when I first read that quote, I was like, my first thought was like, well, this can't be true, right? So we all remember like Gladwell's 10,000 hour debacle. And also I was like, when I thought about it, I was like, this doesn't really make any sense, right? Because like, if the average SAT score of your peers is higher, chances are good, right? Like if you got into a more selective school, right? Like physics or computer science isn't different at that school. So you're probably better prepared for whatever you wanted to major in. So it seemed like it didn't seem like a very credible claim, which is why I wanted to investigate the paper in the first place. And then when I did invest, and as I was investigating the paper, I was also thinking about this anecdote of mine from college.
All right, and there is a question in the chat from Grace.
Is there any similar data on liberal arts colleges where majors aren't declared in the first year? That's a good question. I don't know. There probably are. There are probably surveys where they look at retention over all 4 years. I even saw there are a few papers that looked at retention over 6 years, right? So like if at any point you declare that you wanted a STEM degree and then you got one within the next 6 years, they counted that as being retained.
Awesome. Thank you everybody for coming. Oh, I'm so happy you could all join us this week. Next week, we have our own Journal Club member, Caroline Phipps, presenting. I hope to see you all there. The talk will be on intelligence and color perception in cephalopods, which I'm unfamiliar with, but excited to learn about.
Shrimp.
Exciting.
Shrimp? Oh, and shrimp. Octopi?
Octopus, sorry.
Why did you say shrimp? Color perception and octopi. I hope to see you all there to learn more about octopi and not shrimp. Goodbye.
Bye. Y'all know that this is going on YouTube, right? So like there's now 5 seconds of awkwardness on YouTube where Luke D and Willow are talking about. By the way, Wes, that was like amazing. Seriously.
Thank you.
Actually, let's stop recording. Hold on.